In the heart of Al-Andalus, nestled in the southern mountains of what is now Spain, lay a city called Granada. In the year 1066, it was a thriving center of culture and commerce, a jewel of the Muslim world. In a city where Jews, Muslims, and Christians lived side by side, sharing streets, markets, and sometimes uneasy silence. But in a single day, that silence would shatter. This is the story of a massacre, a forgotten massacre, one that erupted with poetry, envy, and betrayal, and ended in fire, blood, and ruin. This is the story of the 1066 Granada Massacre. At the center of the city stood a man, Joseph ibn Naghrela. He was the son of a legend, Samuel Hanagid, a Jewish scholar, poet, and vizier who had risen to power in the Zirid Muslim court. Joseph was educated, wealthy, and brilliant. He spoke Arabic, Hebrew, Berber, and Latin. He advised kings, settled political disputes, and ran the internal affairs of Granada like a maestro conducting an orchestra. But behind the power came whispers. People said Joseph was arrogant, others said he was manipulative, and many more said he was simply too powerful for a Jew. In a Muslim court, under a Berber dynasty, that mattered. He was, in their eyes, too visible, too vocal, too successful. And then came a poem. Its author was a man named Abu Ishaq, a Berber poet with a sharp tongue and a sharper grudge. He wrote a qasida, an Arabic poem meant to inflame, to provoke, and it did. It spread across Granada like wildfire. A line from that poem still echoes through history. Do not consider it a breach of faith to kill them. They have violated our covenant. They are prominent. We are humble. Those verses didn't just rhyme. They dripped with resentment. They painted Joseph, and by extension, all Jews, as parasites, as threats, as enemies of Islam, hiding in plain sight. Then came the rumors that Joseph was plotting to poison the king's son, that he was planning to hand Granada over to its rivals, that his loyalty was a lie. None of it was proven, but the truth didn't matter. The poem had already done its work. The people were angry. The king, Badis al-Muzaffar, was aging and isolated, and Joseph was alone at the top. The pressure was building. And then it exploded. On the 9th of Tevet, in the Hebrew year 4827, which was December 30th, 1066, the streets of Granada filled with fury. A mob formed, a crowd of Berbers, incited by the poem, the rumors, and years of resentment. They stormed the palace where Joseph had taken shelter. He tried to hide. He blackened his face with soot. He crawled into a coal bin, but they found him. They dragged him from his hiding place, screaming. And then they killed him, brutally, publicly. They dragged his body through the street and nailed it to a wooden cross. A message, not just to his allies, but to every Jew in Granada. With Joseph dead, the killing began. The mob turned to the Jewish quarter. They smashed doors. They dragged families into the streets, children, elders, women, rabbis. They murdered them, house by house, street by street. Some were burned alive in their homes. Others were beheaded. Some were thrown from rooftops. In just one day, over 1,500 Jewish families, more than 4,000 men, women, and children, were slaughtered. Granada ran red. When the fires cooled, when the bodies were buried, when the smoke cleared, Granada's Jewish community was gone. Some survivors fled, others converted. A few lived in silence. Joseph's wife escaped. His son, Azariah, made it out, but died young, never to rise as his father once had. The city never punished the mob. The king did nothing. and the Jewish Golden Age in Granada ended that day. History remembers the Holocaust, the Inquisition, the pogroms of Eastern Europe. But what happened in Granada on that winter day in 1066 was one of the earliest, bloodiest, and most brutal anti-Jewish massacres in European history. And yet, few remember it now. You do. The rise of Joseph ibn Naghrela. Before the flames, before the hatred, before the blood ran through Granada's stone streets, there was a boy, a brilliant boy, born into a powerful legacy. Joseph ibn Naghrela was not just anyone. He was the son of Samuel Hanagid, one of the most remarkable Jewish figures of medieval Spain. Samuel was a poet, a philosopher, a general, and a vizier to the Berber king of Granada. That alone made history. A Jewish man leading armies in a Muslim kingdom. He wrote Hebrew poems before battle, then led Muslim troops into war and won. Under Samuel's leadership, the Jewish community of Granada thrived. He protected them, elevated them, and gave them something rare in a dangerous world: dignity. Joseph grew up in that world, in palaces, not ghettos, among scholars, not beggars. He inherited not only his father's wealth, but his title, his enemies, and the weight of Granada itself. Joseph was educated in the classics. He could quote the Torah, the Quran, and Aristotle in multiple languages. He had the confidence of the king, Badis al-Muzaffar, who trusted him with nearly all civil affairs. Joseph negotiated tax policy. He oversaw military appointments. He dealt with foreign envoys. To the outside world, he was a man of reason. But behind palace walls, not everyone was charmed. Many in the Berber elite saw him as manipulative. They whispered that Joseph was not leading with the king. He was leading for the king. And that was dangerous. The city of Granada in the 11th century was a melting pot boiling over. Muslims ruled, but Berber and Arab factions often clashed. Christians in the north were growing restless, and Jews, though tolerated, were always vulnerable to changing moods. Joseph may have believed that his brilliance would protect him, but in truth, his power only drew fire. He made enemies at court, especially among Berber commanders and rival ministers who hated answering to a Jew. When his father had ruled, his charisma shielded him. When Joseph ruled, his arrogance fueled resentment. And while he may have been right, he was not safe. One of those enemies was Abu Ishaq, a poet, scholar, and Islamic purist. Abu Ishaq resented Joseph's rise. He resented Jewish influence, and he resented being outshined. So he wrote a poem, not just a poem, a weapon, each line crafted like a blade, sharpened to cut through tolerance and set fire to hearts. His message was chilling. How can you be content when those who were your slaves now rule over you? They have violated the pact. Killing them is no sin. The poem spread like ash in the wind, read in mosques, whispered in taverns, recited in the marketplace. It was the match, and Joseph was the fuse. Rumors began to surface that Joseph was conspiring with Christian kings, that he was plotting to betray King Battus and place the crown on someone else's head. No evidence, no witnesses, only whispers. But whispers were enough. Joseph tried to hold on. He doubled down on palace control. He cut off rivals. He silenced criticism. But the mood had shifted. And in Granada, moods could kill. The man who once stood above the city would soon lie broken beneath it. The day the sky fell, December 30th, 1066. December 30th, 1066. In the streets of Granada, the sun rose, but peace did not. There was no warning, no official declaration, no royal edict, only anger, only fire, only blood. That morning, the city seemed normal. Merchants opened their shops. Children played in narrow alleys. The muezzin called the faithful to prayer. But something hung in the air. Whispers. Poetry laced with venom. Old resentments boiling into new rage. Crowds began to form, first in the market, then near the palace gates. Berber soldiers, artisans, disillusioned youth, old men with broken pride and young men with sharpened steel. They had no orders. They had no leaders. But they had a target. Joseph had heard the whispers. He felt the tension. Still, he believed the king would protect him. After all, he had served the throne for years. But the king did nothing. As the mob pressed into the palace, Joseph fled into a cellar. He blackened his face with soot, hid himself in a pile of coal, held his breath, waited. But they found him, dragged him from the shadows, stripped him, beaten him. Then, in the heart of the courtyard, they murdered him. They didn't just kill Joseph, they displayed him. They nailed his body to a wooden cross, hung it above the palace gates, a message to his people. Your protector is gone. Your time is over. Blood pooled beneath the scaffold. Children stared in horror. The crowd erupted in shouts of victory, while others wept in silence. Joseph ibn Naghrela, once the most powerful Jew in Al-Andalus, was reduced to a mangled corpse in the public square. With Joseph dead, the mob turned south, toward the Jewish quarter. They carried axes, torches, rage. Door after door was kicked in. Families were dragged from their homes. Old men were stabbed in the street. Women were torn from their children. Children were not spared. Some were burned alive inside their homes. Others were cut down while trying to flee. There was no mercy, no negotiation, no chance, just a slaughter. We don't have detailed eyewitness accounts. No survivor wrote a diary. No poet captured the screams. But we know what happened, because when the sun set, over 4,000 Jews were dead, 1,500 families gone, their homes destroyed, synagogues reduced to rubble, Torah scrolls burned in the street. It was over by nightfall, and when the last flame died out, Granada's Jewish community died with it. King Badis al-Muzaffar said nothing. He did nothing. He neither condemned the mob, nor punished the killers, nor honored the dead. He allowed it to happen, perhaps even welcomed it, and in doing so, he erased one of the most remarkable Jewish chapters in medieval history. For a time, the survivors lived in shadows. Some fled to Lucena, others to Cordoba. Some converted, hoping to escape the next wave of fury. But what was lost could never be rebuilt. Granada was no longer a place of tolerance. It had become a grave. There are moments in history that shake the earth, and others that happen quietly but leave deep scars across time. The Granada Massacre was both a day of horror, a lesson unlearned, a silence that still echoes. What led to this? History doesn't bleed in isolation. No massacre begins on the day it happens. To understand why 4,000 Jews were murdered in a single day, we have to look deeper, to old divisions, old resentments, and the slow, steady decay of trust. Al-Andalus was a fractured world. On paper, it was a Muslim kingdom, but in practice, it was divided. Berbers had conquered this land, fierce mountain warriors from North Africa. They fought the wars, spilled the blood, held the front lines. But the Arabs, they held the titles, the wealth, the poetry, the power. To the Berbers, this felt like betrayal. They were treated as second class, even in the empire they bled for. And that bitterness grew. Into this tension stepped the Jews of Granada, educated, multilingual, connected to trade routes, courts, and culture. People like Samuel ibn Naghrela, Joseph's father, had risen high, even serving as vizier and commander of armies. To many Muslims, this was astonishing. A Jew commanding Muslims, a non-believer holding a royal power. This was more than political. It was emotional, religious, personal. Even though the Jewish community was small, just 5% of the city, its influence was massive, and resentment began to boil. Joseph inherited his father's post, but he lacked his father's tact. He was brilliant, yes, but arrogant, dismissive. Surrounded by Jewish scholars, poets, and advisors, he taxed the people heavily. He replaced Muslim officials with Jews. He acted like royalty, without the bloodline. To the common man, Joseph wasn't just a symbol. He was a provocation. Sometimes one verse can ignite a fire. Abu Ishaq, a respected Andalusi poet, penned the fatal lines. Do not consider it a breach of faith to kill them, for they have violated the pact and deserve extermination. This was no private scribble. It was public, distributed, copied, recited. The poem didn't simply criticize Joseph. It called for violence. It framed murder as justice. It dressed genocide in the cloak of religious duty. It was poetry turned into a weapon, and it worked. By the end of 1066, the ingredients were in place. A Jewish vizier with unchecked power. A Berber population that felt humiliated and overlooked. A fragile king more interested in survival than justice. And a poet who gave moral license to murder. What happened on December 30th wasn't spontaneous. It was an explosion. But the fuse had been lit long before. For centuries, Jews had lived under Muslim rule. In many ways, they had thrived. They spoke Arabic. They held key positions. They contributed to science, philosophy, and medicine. But they were still dhimmis, protected, but subordinate. When Joseph rose too high, when Jewish wealth became too visible, when Jewish advisors outnumbered Muslim ones, that uneasy peace broke, not just in Granada, but in the hearts of those who had tolerated them. Were there Muslims who stood up, who tried to stop the massacre? History is frustratingly quiet on this. No records of mass resistance. No edicts condemning the violence. But silence does not mean consent. It might mean fear. It might mean helplessness. Still, no one stopped it. And that speaks louder than anything else. The Granada Massacre wasn't just a failure of protection. It was a failure of imagination. A city forgot that coexistence is fragile, that power, when hoarded, becomes a blade, and that hate, once released, does not return quietly. Legacy and the silence after. Massacres don't end when the blood dries. They echo, in whispers, in erasures, in the silence that follows. What happened in Granada in 1066 was historic, but what followed was even more telling. Those who lived had only two choices: flee or convert. Most fled to Lucena, to Egypt, to anywhere the shadow of the tower wouldn't follow them. Entire families vanished from the city. Graves went unmarked. Synagogues were destroyed or converted. The Jewish presence in Granada, once the crown jewel of Sephardic life, was gutted overnight, and it would never recover. King Badis, the ruler of Granada, survived the chaos. But he did not punish the mob. He did not mourn Joseph. He did not rebuild the community. He ruled as if nothing had happened. Why? Perhaps he feared the people more than he valued his vizier. Perhaps Joseph had become too dangerous, even to him. Or maybe he believed it was the cost of keeping the throne. Regardless, he ruled in peace, on the ashes of a slaughter. What's striking about the Granada Massacre is how quickly it disappeared from memory. Unlike the pogroms of Eastern Europe, or the Inquisition in Spain, or the Holocaust centuries later, this event was rarely taught, rarely studied, rarely mourned. Jewish texts mention it briefly. Islamic records mostly omit it. Western historians ignored it for centuries. Why? Because it didn't fit the narrative. There's a romanticized idea of Jewish life under Islam, a golden age, where Jews were safe, respected, integrated. And yes, that was sometimes true. But Granada shattered that myth. It showed that tolerance had limits, that even in Al-Andalus, so rich with learning and light, prejudice simmered below the surface. The massacre was proof. Jews were never more than tolerated, and tolerance is not the same as equality. Ironically, the only part of the massacre that endured was the poem that may have sparked it. Abu Ishaq's verses survived. They were copied, admired, quoted. A literary masterpiece, they said. Even though those words led to rivers of blood, it raises a question. Can beauty excuse violence? Can a poem be art and also a weapon? The answer lives in the streets of Granada, where echoes still breathe between the stones. The Jewish presence in Islamic Spain once numbered in the hundreds of thousands. They gave the world Maimonides, Judah Halevi, a flowering of poetry, science, philosophy. But Granada's massacre marked the beginning of decline. Persecution increased, freedom narrowed, exile became the new inheritance. By the time Ferdinand and Isabella expelled all Jews from Spain in 1492, the message was clear. Golden ages end, sometimes in fire. So what do we take from this? That words matter, that power isolates, that history, left unspoken, repeats. We cannot afford to forget these moments, not because they are comfortable, but because they are warnings. In the end, Joseph ibn Naghrela may have been many things, arrogant, brilliant, ambitious. But no one deserves what happened. No child, no family, no people. History whispers, but it does not forget. The walls of Granada remember, even if we don't. And in the silence that follows horror, we must choose to speak.